Okay. Acha, before I move on, just let me know. Everyone, please, not today, but from the next class, we're going to need this particular software. Okay, kindly install this particular software. It's a free software, and you can simply type in Google and you're going to get it. You can download it from this particular server. I'm also sending you the site link. Okay, simply click on this download now. It's going to get downloaded, and it's free for everyone. You don't have to pay a thing. Okay, just in the next class we're going to require this software, so kindly download it. Okay. Okay, so now let's start this. Now the topics today we're going to talk about this particular is the proteomics, that whole bioinformatics part. Now the thing that actually is that this bioinformatics is not a single domain. Okay, there are several domains of science that are actually associated with this bioinformatics field. For example, this through bioinformatics we can use the bioinformatics to our advantage for the in case of protein designing or modeling protein or structural proteins, or we can use that for our other advantage like the CAD, the computer aided drug designing part. That also takes the help of the bioinformatics. And apart from it, from even tiny molecular biology, if you need to consider or perform the molecular biology experiments, they also require certain bioinformatic tools for their to perform a experiment smoothly. Okay, so right now this whole bioinformatics has been associated with us. It has been actually integrated into this part of our life, and nowhere actually even the vaccine designing, the whole there is a separate domain that bioinformatics that talks about this immunology, and that is known as immunoinformatics. Okay, and that whole domain is actually associated from targeting or identifying various domains of immunology, starting from vaccine designing till and finding out why or how a particular bacteria or virus activates your immune system. Everything is actually associated, or you can actually tend, or you can give the answer through bioinformatics. So why the hell do we need bioinformatics? Because first of all, it's not that apart from without the help of bioinformatics you can't do these things. You can do these things, but just currently see this example that right now the vaccine designing, earlier it used to take around 15 to 20 years to complete. Okay, a single vaccine designing, but currently this particular vaccine has been done in record time. The vaccine against this COVID-19, they have been designed in record time, within a year, and not by a single. It's not that only a single company or a single university or single faculty has been achieved that particular merit. No, there are lots of company and people that are associated with this particular thing who have actually done this. You have the Sputnik, you have Covishield, you have Covaxin, you have the mRNA vaccine. So you have multiple ways. But how could they do it in this record time? Because all are actually taking the help of this particular bioinformatics. Now bioinformatics talk about everything, right from your sequence generation or sequencing a particular protein, or to go from simply identifying a particular protein, or simply talking about something. Everything is actually associated. Everything is associated with this particular bioinformatics. So the part that we're going to talk first is actually this particular the proteomics domain. Proteomics domain. Now, can anyone say what is proteomics?
Sir, the study of protein.
The study of protein.
Sir, proteomics. Sir, can you say?
Yes, go on. Don't worry. You don't have to be right or something. Just a discussion. Come on.
Okay, sir, I think proteomics is sequencing the like amino acid sequencing, and the way we know the structure of proteins by the sequencing, by
okay, so you're talking about identifying the sequence of a particular protein, right? So
right.
So yes, you are partly correct, and yes, the other one who had gave the answer, you are also partly correct. And why? Because proteomics is not about a study of a single protein. Proteomics is actually the study of the entire proteome of your system, entire proteome of a system. Now that system might be a tissue, That system might be a cell, that system might be an organism. If you study the proteome, the total, now what is proteome? The proteome is the total protein content of a particular system. The total protein content. So if you are talking about cell, there are almost thousands and thousands of different proteins. So all the proteins constitute the proteome. So if you are talking about now the system might change, the system might be an organism. Now in that respect, the total protein content of all of the cell, each of the cell, each of the tissue will comprise the proteomics. If the system is a particular tissue, then the protein content of that particular tissue will be proteomics. And if you are talking about cell, then the protein of that particular cell. And this proteomics is actually a mixed bag. There are different multiple sector of proteomics. Okay, it's not that now when I say study, what I am studying, there are multitude of avenues that we can actually study about a particular protein, right? Multitude of avenues, and all these avenues, they all comprises of this proteomics. So the first question that comes to mind is, why the hell should we know about every protein? It's better to know about a single protein, right? So why should I know about every protein? Anyone? Any answer? What is the utility of this proteomics?
So each and every protein has its different function. So it is necessary to know each and every structure of the all proteins and all.
Fantastic, very good. But if I yes, say another answer. Come on. Yes, go on.
It could help us in modifying the immune system or designing the enzymes.
That's an absolute good answer. Very good. So I got two answers. The one answer is actually telling me that we have to study everything about a particular, so we have to know all the structure of all the proteins. Yes, that's a very good answer. But the thing is that, so
Sir, I have also.
yeah, sure.
Sir, so that if we know the different structure of protein, we can compare and we can know the protein structure of the unknown protein. Sir.
Okay, so the thing is that yes, we can know about the unknown protein. It's a much more sophisticated answer. It's a good answer. Now, suppose if I tell you that you are all students, so why not you are all studying? Suppose you are studying biotechnology or microbiology or a particular domain of biology, right? So if I tell you that, why not you study everything? You study geography, history, physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, statistics, study everything. Will it be possible for you to study everything? It won't be possible for us to study everything. So that's how we can't study each and every protein in a proteomics. It's really difficult for a single person to study each and every protein or to find the structure of every protein. So it's really difficult. Then why are we interested about this proteomics? Because generally the protein doesn't work alone. For example, suppose you are running a school or you are running a class now, or a college. Now, is that university, college or school, can it be run by a single person? No, it can't, because there is one person who is the headmaster. There is another peon who actually simply rings that bell after the finish of each class. There is someone who actually maintains all the attendance registry, that yes, every students are present or not, and if in a current year how many days have a particular student missed. So there are multiple persons who actually manages everything in a particular office or in a particular working decorum, right? Now the thing is that because a single particular person can't work alone, that happens with the protein also, because every person needs to interact with one another. And same thing goes for protein. A protein can't work alone. Why? Because to work or to manifest its function, a protein has to interact with different protein. So suppose I am interested about a particular protein called protein A. I want to read about protein A, I want to study about protein A, and I found out that particular protein A is actually associated with cancer. So let's give it name a VEGF. Anyone knows the function of the protein VEGF? Okay. So VEGF is one of the protein that actually talks about or deals with angiogenesis. Okay. And what is angiogenesis? Now this I think you should know. What is angiogenesis? Angiogenesis
Sir,
actually,
it's
yeah.
sir, it's associated with heart surgery.
Heart? Can you repeat again? I didn't hear it. Can you repeat again? I didn't hear it clearly. You are connected, right?
Sir, I
Yes.
it's associated with heart surgery. Like,
Heart surgery? No, not that. Not completely heart surgery. Yes, it has something to do with heart, but not heart surgery. VEGF is actually a protein that actually helps in formation of new blood vessels. The angiogenesis. It is formation of new blood vessel. Yes, it actually has a similarity tone with the angiograph and something like that. But angiogenesis generally means formation.
sir, I have thought,
Yes.
yes, sir, I have thought it was angioplasty. Like,
Yeah.
it was angioplasty, I guess.
Yeah, it has a similar ring to it. So angiogenesis generally means formation of new blood vessel. So actually this particular thing is associated with cancer. Okay, whenever a particular this VEGF protein gets overexpressed, and then that particular cell or those cell in that vicinity, they all push towards the cancerous condition. Okay, and it is found that in most of the tumors this VEGF protein is the one protein that is overexpressed. Now this VEGF doesn't work alone. It is found that though VEGF is overexpressed, but to help VEGF there are multiple proteins. The VEGF must bind to CMYC protein, which in turn must bind to E2F protein, which in turn binds to BCL2 protein to maintain that CMYC E2F BCL2 VEGF axis. And with the help of that, they help in cell proliferation, cellular growth, or in apoptosis. Okay. So the main thing is that each protein has to bind with some other protein to manifest their function. And generally, we all fall ill because of this misbehavior of a particular protein. When every protein is working correctly, we don't fall ill. But how when we fall ill? When a particular protein starts to misbehave. For example, suppose protein A goes and binds to protein B, which in turn activates the protein B to bind to protein C. Thereby protein BC complex then again suppose goes and binds to protein D, and thereby the whole signaling pathway process. But suppose there is a mutation and that prevents the protein A to bind to protein B. Now if protein A doesn't bind to protein B, what will happen? The protein B is not going to get activated, which in turn is not going to bind to protein C, which in turn obviously if that doesn't form a complex, it is not going to bind to protein D. So you see, though one protein is actually got a mutation, it is affecting 3 more protein down the line. So this is why we should study proteomics, because a single protein doesn't affect the total body. Yes, a cause might be a single protein, but there is multitude of proteins or many proteins which are in succession downline of that particular protein that actually gets hampered, and that's why we should learn about the proteomics. We should learn that how a single protein misbehavior. Now this misbehavior might be a mutation, this misbehavior might be a protein unfolding, it might be a destabilization. How this particular protein actually affects the total protein content of the entire system, and how does the disease kicks in, because a single protein is rarely associated with a disease. Generally there are multiple proteins that actually help in that particular disease formation, be it cancer, be it diabetes, be it anything, anything, it actually happens due to multiple proteins. So that's what we need to see. But there is actually a problem with proteomics, and the problem is that the proteome is not a constant property in your body. Yes, it is not a constant. The genomic is actually the constant part of your body. The genomics is actually constant part. How? Because this genomics, what happens? The genomics, as you can see, your gene sequence, right from your birth till your death, the gene sequence is not changing. It doesn't change, provided you are not getting some mutations. There might be some sort of point mutations in your lifetime, and even though there are, the gene is actually not changing. So more or less it is constant. Okay, more or less it's constant, because in a whole lifetime you might be getting almost 10 or 12 mutations in your gene. Okay, that too in a significant region. Apart from it, generally people doesn't get that kind of mutation in the main signature genes. Yes, we get mutation, but not in that particular area where it affects the genomic integrity. Okay, but in case of proteins, what happens? The proteome actually changes a lot. How? Because there are some proteins which are selectively expressed at a particular point of time. There are some proteins which gets expressed during morning. There are some protein which gets expressed at night. Okay, and how? For example, there's a particular protein called melatonin. Have anyone heard this name, melatonin?
Yes, sir. It's secreted from the pineal gland.
Yes, and what is its function?
It helps in sleep and wake cycle, and it's basically secreted during night. That's why we fall asleep.
Absolutely right. Absolutely bang on answer. Yes. Melatonin is one of the proteins that is selectively produced at night, and that actually helps to maintain the sleep cycle. So how does the brain feel that yes, it is night? How does the brain knows the circadian rhythm or circadian clock? By maintaining or seeing the intensity of light outside. So amount of light that is entering through our eye, that is the signal to the brain. Okay, that's a signal to a particular part of the brain that yes, it is still daytime, we don't want that particular protein. Okay, and how does it happen? Because at morning we have a lot of light, and as the day progresses, the light intensity goes down, and obviously slowly there is night and the melatonin starts secreting. That is why if you use too much of screen time at night, then the brain actually gets confused, because brain doesn't understand that whether the light is coming from, it doesn't discriminate between the source of light. It only understands light. So if it is not coming from sun, even if it is coming from tube light or your mobile screen or your desktop or laptop, that also signals the brain that it is not yet night. We are having a lot of light. So what happens? The melatonin secretion stops, and that is why people advises that whenever you sleep, try to maintain a complete pitch dark when you sleep. Don't try to maintain that, and that is why we close our eyelids while we sleep. Okay, because it actually prevents the entering of any light, and that is why people ask you that don't use too much of screen time. At least 1 hour before you sleep, try to minimize the screen time. Don't use mobile for at least 1 hour before you sleep, because what happens if you use the mobile, then the melatonin, though you might be feeling sleepy, the melatonin is not there, and it actually hampers the total sleep cycle. Now you might say that it doesn't matter, I can sleep at morning. Yes, you can sleep at morning, but do you know that this circadian rhythm clock, this is also associated with the immunological parameters. It also controls the immunity of the system, and there are many. It also helps to control the production of these antibodies, this T cells, B cell. Apart from it, the interleukins, they are also connected with the functioning of this whole circadian rhythm. So if by any chance, if you hamper your sleep cycle, it also affects your immunity. That's why whenever you fall ill, people say that doctor asks you to take rest. Why should you take rest? Because if you are taking rest properly, then that particular protein cycle or the circadian rhythms starts perfectly. It actually makes sure that your body gets accustomed to that particular circadian rhythm, and as a result, the total T cell, B cell, interleukins, all those things actually starts getting secreted, and you are coming out of that particular disease. Okay, and that is why. And not only that, there are several other proteins like BAML1, the clock protein. These all proteins are actually produced selectively at a certain point of time. So that is why while experimenting or performing experiments with proteomics, if you isolate your proteome of a particular cell at 12 p.m. First day, and supposed to in the next day you are isolating the total protein at the evening, you are going to get a total different protein content. You won't be able to compare your experimental results. It's going to change, and sometimes even as low as 2-hour time duration changes the protein content. It changes the protein content. That is why whenever you are working with this particular proteomics, make sure you are having a The collection of the proteome should be at a particular time of day. Yes, if you're collecting at 12 p.m., you might collect it at 1 p.m. the next day. You might collect it at 12:30 the next day. But make sure you're not collecting it at 3 p.m. or 5 p.m., 4 p.m., 6 p.m. or 8 p.m. Okay. And it's better to maintain a proper time. So half an hour plus minus 30 minutes is a good thing. Okay, it doesn't affect much, but try to not maintain that. Now this particular, so why this? Because there are some proteins which are selectively expressed at a particular, not at a particular time, but also at particular tissues. There are several important proteins that are expressed only at a particular tissue, and that part goes to the expression proteomics. Now this whole proteomics is actually, so why do we need the proteomics? Because it helps us to locate there are a number of things that we help the proteomics spot. Or first thing that we help the proteomics spot to find out the location of a particular protein. Where is the particular protein located? Whether it is present, whether it's a cytosolic protein or a nuclear protein, or if it is a mitochondrial protein, or if that particular protein is a cell membrane protein, or if that particular protein is a secreted protein. These things we can learn. We can also know about the expression, how much that particular protein is getting expressed, and at what condition the protein expression hastens up. For example, yes, you might find that at a particular disease, 1 or 2 protein might be getting expressed at more in number. So when that happens, you know that those particular proteins might be the cause for that particular disease. Or on the other hand, those proteins might also be associated with your immunology. And since you are sick, those particular proteins are getting overexpressed to make sure that you are getting cured. Okay. And apart from it, you also learn or try to use this proteomics to study the post-translational modifications. Okay. Now there are generally 3 branches of this particular bioinformatic part. If we talk only about proteomics, then there are generally 3 branches. So one branch, or the first branch, is actually the expression bioinformatics or the expression proteomics. Now this expression proteomics is actually talks about the expression of a particular protein, how much that particular protein is getting expressed. Because at every tissues the protein expression is different, and at every tissue the protein expression is different. For example, can anyone say why the COVID virus infects our lungs? A very basic question, because from the last 2 years everyone is actually now aware of this COVID virus, the mode of action, the mechanism of actions, everything. So anyone, how does it, or why does it affect the lungs?
Because it has a substrate that only reacts with the cells of lung.
Yes, and what is that?
Receptor?
Receptor, absolutely. But can you name the receptor?
No, I don't know that.
Okay, that is ACE2 receptor. Okay, ACE2 receptor. Now that particular receptor is present not only in lungs, but it is also present in hearts and kidneys. Do you know that ACE2 receptor is not only present in lungs, it is present in huge quantity in hearts and kidneys. But still, why is the coronavirus not impacting heart or kidney? Why it is going only to the lungs? Because yes, you are right, it binds to a receptor, and the receptor is the ACE2 receptor. But why is it binding only to the ACE2 receptor of lungs, but not to the kidney or heart? And this is a very basic question. Simply a basic question. I mean, you don't have to know physics or science for this question. A little bit thinking, that would do. Please try.
Because it's airborne.
Because it's airborne. A little bit precise. Yes, you are on the right track. A little bit precise. Because of its route of entry, because the COVID virus gains entry through the nasal, it gains entry through the nose and through the mouth. That is why it affects the lungs. Had it infected you through the blood, it would have infected your heart and kidney as well. But since it is gaining entry only through your nasal passage, it is concised, or it is actually present only in the lungs. Okay. That is why. So you see this particular expression of this ACE2 receptor is actually responsible for the attack or binding of this particular COVID virus to your lungs. Okay. So similarly, there are several important receptors or several important proteins that are specifically found in some tissues that are not present in other tissues, and those actually when people tries to identify about those particular proteins or expression of a particular protein in a disease, we talk about the expression proteomics part or the expression bioinformatics part. Next, the interaction proteomics, interaction bioinformatics deals with the interaction of a particular molecule or interaction of a particular protein with other molecule. Now that other molecule might be a protein, it might be a DNA. So to study about their interaction, how they are interacting with which partner it interacting, what is its binding site, how it is interacting, these are the things that actually discusses about this interaction proteomics. Okay, with what residues, the atomic nitty-gritty of their binding, these are the things that we can know about from the interaction proteomics. And the final part is the structural proteomics. Now obviously sometimes for drugs, simply think of it, suppose I want to design a drug against a particular protein. Now as I've told you, the proteins are majorly responsible for your disease. So obviously while we do it, we tend to develop a drug against a particular protein. Okay, now that particular protein, so obviously to design a drug you have to know its structure, because otherwise how can I know for sure that my drug will go and bind to that exact protein or not? There are thousands of protein in my body. How would a drug select and bind to that particular protein? It is going to bind to that particular protein using the shape complementarity method, because every protein is different. Structurally each protein is different, and since they are so different, we develop a ligand or a drug using their structural features, using their topology. And since the topology is really different from each protein, we can have or generate a particular molecule depending upon the shape complementarity method. Simply like how a substrate binds to enzyme, that's how we define or design a ligand that can bind to its target protein. But obviously to develop a ligand according to the shape complementarity method of the particular protein, we have to know the structure of the protein. Now sometimes it is not possible to experimentally verify or find out the structure of a protein. At that moment, this structural bioinformatics actually comes us to help, and that actually helps us to deduce the structure of a particular protein, and that is known as protein modeling. So that's the thing that we're going to learn. Okay, so we have to learn how can the protein, so before that we have to learn about the basic protein structure. Okay, and how does a particular molecule, what are the properties that are actually evaluated by this particular softwares to predict the structure, right? So these are the various things that we're going to learn about. Okay, now but there are certain problems that are associated with this particular proteomics part. And as one thing that I've already told you, that the proteomics is actually a variable thing. It actually changes a lot. So you have a protein, now that protein is going to change its structure. Okay, because not change structure, it might change its expression pattern, and the proteomics is always vary from cell to cell and from time to time, because the protein content of a liver cell is not similar as the protein content of the kidney cell, whereas the kidney cell protein content is not similar as the protein content of the heart cell. Okay, so every tissue have a different kind of protein expression, so it is really completely different. So there is no unifying factor for a particular proteomics. Okay, whereas the genomics is more or less constant, right? On the other hand, there are some we know that how we get a protein, we get that particular thing called we have the replication. After replication, we get the production of this mRNA, so we have transcription, and those mRNAs actually then undergoes translation to give that particular protein. Now sometimes this protein, whoever actually works with protein, they try not to work with protein. Why? Because purifying protein is a huge work, and sometimes you are unable to purify a particular protein, and even if you can purify, the amount of protein that you purify actually is much less. So that's why people, rather than identifying or analyzing the protein, they analyzes the RNA, they analyzes the mRNA. Okay, why? Because obviously we know that mRNA actually gets translated to protein. So rather than measuring the protein, they measure the mRNA. But that is not going to give you an accurate answer. Why? Suppose if you want to measure the total protein or number of protein content, you might measure the mRNA, but that is not going to give you a correct answer. Can anyone say why? Even though proteins come from mRNA.
Because of the presence of exons and introns.
Yes, absolutely. Next. I mean, why it will hamper the protein analysis? You are on the right track.
So because
Yes, because
mRNA is not paired with anticodon of mRNA.
not exactly.
Anticodon of
Not
tRNA.
exactly. Not exactly. Just simply think about the exons
Sir,
and yes, say. Go on.
sir, actually, after transcription, there is mRNA. Actually, we get mRNA and then translation, then we get protein. But it is not necessary that we can get only one protein from one mRNA. Due to alternative transcription, we can get several mRNA and
Absolute, not
several
transcription.
proteins.
Alternative splicing. Okay.
Yes, alternative
Yes,
splicing.
absolutely right answer. Because of alternative splicing, from a single mRNA we get multiple protein. So you are going to measure that we have one mRNA, but at protein level you might have multiple protein, or you might have 4 protein coming from a single mRNA. So that is why, due to this alternative splicing that actually happens in our cell, you can't compare mRNA, the amount of mRNA can't be equal to amount of protein. Okay, this is the reason, and that is why people doesn't sometimes, even if you though might think that yes, let's measure the RNA content because it's easy, we simply have to send in some primer, perform a make a cDNA of that particular thing and then perform PCR to know about the content. No, it won't work because of this particular thing called multiple alternative splicing. Okay, so that is why these are some of the things that are actually associated with this proteomics. And apart from it, there is also this post-translational modifications. For example, there are some proteins without this post-translational modifications, they don't get activated. For example, the tyrosine kinases. The tyrosine kinases have to get phosphorylated at their tyrosines to get activated. So even now, if you have isolated a kind of, now not always in your body the kinases are there, but it is not always in an active form. Sometimes the protein are produced, but they are only activated when they are needed. So you might find that yes, there is a huge quantity of protein or tyrosine kinase in this cell, and due to this I might see that yes, that particular cell is also undergoing this cancer, so tyrosine kinase is associated with cancer. No, you can't say that, because you have to make sure that the tyrosine kinases are active, because inactive tyrosine kinase or inactive protein is same as no protein at all, because if the protein is not inactive, if the protein is not active, it is not going to work, so it is same as no protein at all. Okay, that is why this also sometimes makes a difficult in analysis, and sometimes it is really difficult to find out the translational modifications. Why? Because what is post-translational modifications? A particular protein undergoes modification at a particular site. For example, there might be a particular domain, and that particular domain at a particular residue, that particular protein got phosphorylated. Now, how could you? The phosphorylation is a very small molecule. The phosphate group is a very small molecule. How can you distinguish between a phosphorylated protein or an unphosphorylated protein? It is really difficult to distinguish between those two proteins. So it is really difficult to identify if a particular protein has been phosphorylated or not. Okay, so generally these things actually give rise to a particular this ambiguity. And apart from it, protein degradation is also there. The protein generally have some proteins have a very low half-life. It's not that they have multiple half-lives. And again, the mRNAs, they have a very low half-life. So even before you could identify and clear out all the mRNAs, you might find that some of the mRNAs have been degraded. Because why the mRNA have a lower half-life? Because if the mRNA is present in your cell for a long time, it is going to get translated for a long time. You are going to get multiple or overexpressed protein, even though you don't want it. That's why the mRNAs have a very little half-life. The same thing goes for the protein also. Some of the protein have different half-lives. Okay, and they also get degraded. And if the degradation machinery is upregulated, then obviously the number of protein getting degraded will be more. So there are multiple problems associated at this protein level, and that makes this proteomics a little bit problematic for every one of us. Okay. So what is the basic strategy of this whole proteomics? How does it work? Now the first thing is that obviously you have to have the total protein content. You have to have the total protein content of the cell. So how to do? Obviously there are, even though in whichever branch you go, you have to have the cell, you have to have the sample, you have to have isolated the entire protein content of the particular cell. Now once you have isolated the total protein content, you have to separate. You are not going to know which proteins are there or how many type of proteins are there. Is there a single protein or is there 1,000 proteins? Because if I simply go to a class and if I say that every student come here, all of the students are going to come, but how can I segregate all of the students? Right? In your college there might be 20 students in your class. How can you segregate between different students? You all have different names, you all have different roll numbers, right? And using that, everyone is getting segregated. Everyone has a particular place, right? Now similarly, we have to segregate the protein that we are getting. So how to do that? We have to use some either 2D gel electrophoresis or 1D gel electrophoresis, and that is the basic method by which we can actually segregate and separate out the proteins. Because we have to separate the proteins. If we don't separate out the proteins, how we are going to know how many proteins are there, how many or which proteins have we isolated, right? So after we segregate and separate out the proteins, but that is not enough because the proteins doesn't have a face. It's not like that. Even if you simply segregate the protein, you are going to know which protein is that. Every protein A, B, C, D, when you run a gel, every protein will look like a similar protein. If it is yes, the protein, one protein is similar, the second protein is also similar, the third protein is also similar, sorry. Now, the fourth protein is also similar. Every protein is going to be similar. Okay. So how can you segregate and know which proteins have you isolated, which proteins have you found? We have to find out there, we have to characterize them. And generally we use MALDI, we use mass spectroscopy to find that out. Why? Because each protein has a different molecular weight. Each protein's molecular weight is different. Why? Because each protein sequence is different. No two protein in our body have exact same sequence, because if they have exactly same sequence, it is going to mean that it's the same protein. That is why each protein has a different molecular weight, and that molecular weight we can identify from this MALDI-TOF experiment. And there are certain databases where we already know the molecular weight of this particular proteins. Okay, we already know the molecular weight of this particular proteins. So by identifying the molecular weight, we have to cross match that molecular weight with that particular protein, and we know that this protein is here, this protein is here. We have protein A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, all the proteins we can identify. Okay. Now there are general different type of methods of mass spectroscopy. You have ESIMF, you have ESIMS, you have MALDI-TOF, you have LC-MS-MS. Now LC-MS-MS is the one that actually gives you the entire sequence, not only the molecular weight but also the sequence of the protein. So if you find out a protein and you don't know, and suppose that particular protein is a novel protein, nobody else has previously identified or discovered that protein. So how do you know the protein sequence? You can perform LC-MS-MS, and LC-MS-MS is going to give you the entire protein structure. Okay, not the structure, the sequence. And then from that you can identify whether that particular protein is a novel protein or not. Okay. And generally after that you fit that all the data using the mascot, sequence and comet and all them actually has a protein database, and using that protein database they actually identifies which protein is that, and they give you the idea that this is a protein. This is the general workflow of the proteomics. Whatever protein you are doing, you might be doing expression or interaction proteomics, this is the way to find out. Okay. So now we are going to actually focus on this particular structural proteomics part. Acha, till now anyone else have any question?
So can I ask, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Sir, actually we use OS. Sir, I just hearing my voice again. It's equal.
Yes, your voice is getting a little breaking up. Okay, just simply go on.
So we use Western blotting for the protein. Protein.
Identification.
What to say? We
Identification.
protein identification, and
Yes.
we can also use chromatography. Um,
Yes. You
I
can
think
use.
there was HPLC, so I guess chromatography is also used.
Yes, obviously. But the thing is that in Western blot, what do? You know that you are trying to identify only one or two protein, and against that protein you are using the antibodies. Okay. But what if you have thousands of proteins? Because in a proteome pool, we have thousands of proteins. Now you can't use thousands of different antibodies because each antibody, first of all, it is not possible because that's not how the thing works. Because each antibody, if you treat, when you perform a Western blot, it is going to give you a blotch on a screen. Now when there are thousands of proteins, everything is going to give a blotch, and you are going to find a total black spot, a total black lane. You won't be able to identify which protein is there or which protein not. And secondly, the antibodies costs a lot. So it will be really hard for you to bind thousands of different antibodies. And for some proteins, there are no antibodies. Only the antibodies exist for the most widely used or most common proteins. Okay, it's not that every protein has an antibody. Okay, until the particular protein is of any interest to public, the companies, they don't generate that particular antibody. Okay, so that is why the MALDI, the mass spec, is the only method by which you can actually identify the different number of proteins, because as I've told you, there are thousands of proteins. There are thousands of proteins.
Sir,
Yes.
so sir, what is X-ray crystallography then?
X-ray
What
crystallography is
I
help to for the structural determination of a particular protein.
that means it is associated with structural proteomics.
Yes, yes, absolutely right.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Sure. So this whole structural proteomics is what? This actually is bioinformatics part. This structural bioinformatics actually deals with this particular thing called determining the structure of a protein. Now, generally, what are the experiments that we generally form or we do to find out the structure of a protein? What are the experiments associated with the structural elucidation of a particular protein or any biomolecule? Just now someone has mentioned X-ray, right? So X-ray crystallography is one of the tool, and apart from it, come on.
Sir, mass spectrometry, as you have said.
Mass spectrometry, it doesn't give you the structure, it gives you the molecular weight of a protein. You are able to identify the molecule. It's like a weight machine. If you stand up on a weight machine, it's going to give you the weight, that this is a weight. Mass spectroscopy is actually a fine weight machine. In our weight machine, it actually weighs 80 kg, 90 kg, 10 kg, 7 kg. The mass spectroscopy actually weighs 1 Dalton, 5 Dalton, 3 Dalton, 78 Dalton. This is the only difference. So the weight machine can't give you how you look. What can give you how you look? The camera or painting, right? The portrait painting or the camera is only the thing that is going to give you or show you how you look. Similarly, to identify or understand how a protein looks like or to understand the structure, there are 3 experiments. One is the NMR spectrometry, NMR spectroscopy. Then you have the X-ray crystallography, or apart from it, you have the cryo-EM. Okay, the cryo-EM also gives you the structure of that particular protein. Now, there are some problem with this. The first problem is that, as I've told you, for structure elucidation, you have to purify a particular protein. The protein that you want to, for which you want to calculate the structure, you have to purify and identify that particular protein, right? Now that is not always possible. Why? Because protein purification is a very tough job. It's a very tough job, and sometimes the protein that you purify, you are unable to purify in huge quantity, and for a particular protein, you require to elucidate the structure, you require a protein in higher concentration. and it is really difficult to get. And even though you manage to get a high concentration of pure protein, it might not be pure protein. There are several different protein contaminations that are associated with it, and those actually hamper with that particular structure elucidation. And overall, if you talk about the cell membrane protein, the membrane protein have a problem. And what's the problem? Membrane proteins are the most difficult to purify, because they are associated with this particular cell membranes. They are really difficult to isolate, difficult to analyze. Okay, so that is why we have to take, sometimes we have to take the help of this particular bioinformatics to deduce the structure of a particular protein. But how can computer help you in deduction of a protein? How would the computer know how the protein is going to look like? And what are the necessities that we have to, information that we have to provide the computer? What are the necessities or information that we have to provide the computer? These are things that we're going to learn. Okay. Now, before we going into that, how to the protein structure is done, we have to know about the basic protein chemistry. How the protein structure, or what's the basic structural property of the proteins, because this is how the thing or the molecules or the servers or the softwares isolate or identifies the protein structure. Okay, now we all know that protein is generally made up of 20 amino acids, right? Now all these 20 amino acids also have different physical and chemical properties, and some of the physical chemical properties might be overlapped, might be different. For example, these amino acids are currently divided into different terms. Some of the amino acids are polar amino acid, some of them are non-polar amino acid. Now what is polar? Polar means those amino acids which can actually interact with water, which are solubilized in water, whereas some of the amino acids that are non-polar means they simply don't mix up with water well. They are hydrophobic in nature, whereas in some cases you have the amino acids which are positively charged, for example lysine, arginine, whereas you have aspartic acid and glutamic acid which are negatively charged. So you see, though amino acid looks similar, though they have a basic backbone, a common backbone, that means they have a free amide group, they have a free carboxyl group, and they have a free OH, COH group, okay, and the free amide group and the R group. Now this hydrogen is common, the hydrogen amide group and the carboxyl group is common for everyone. The only thing that varies is the R group, and that actually determines the protein or the amino acid chemistry. And based upon this particular chemistry, the protein structure changes. How it does it? But there is one exception, and that is the proline. Why it is different? Because you see, the proline. Can you say what is difference? What is most different in case of proline from all the other amino acid? You can even take a look at the structure that it's already written in the screen. But can you identify the difference? That is only present in proline, and that is lacking in all other amino acids.
It has a ring-like structure.
So ring-like structures are also present in histidine, in tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine. They also have the ring-like structure. Apart from it,
It has only one hydrogen attached to the nitrogen.
it has one hydrogen attached to the.
That the ring part, sir.
Right. You are right. But your answer should be a little bit. It's a little bit diverted. You are absolutely right. But your answer should be, it doesn't have a free amide group. Right? It doesn't have a free amide group.
Yeah.
All other amino acids, they have a free amide group. They have a free NH2, free NH2, free. Every amino acid have a free amide group. Only proline doesn't have a free amide group. And that actually makes proline stand out from the entire crowd. And that actually also changes the protein structure. It affects the protein structure. Do you know how it affects? We're going to learn about it. Don't worry. So now this is the proteins. This is the amino acid structure by which the protein chemistry actually depends. Now, how the protein structure looks like? There are actually multiple layers of a protein structure. First, we have a primary structure. Then we have a secondary structure, tertiary structure, quaternary structure. So, what is primary structure? The primary structure is only the sequence of the protein. The protein is one amino acid connects to the next amino acid, which connects to the third amino acid, which fourth. This is the entire sequence. The entire sequence of the protein is the primary structure which starts from a N terminal and ends with a C terminal. That means at one end you have a free amide group, on the other end you have a free carboxylic group. Okay, that is how the protein structure actually changes, and this is the primary structure of a protein. Okay, now as you see, sometimes what happens, these proteins, they can actually interact in multiple ways. They have the propensity to participate in hydrogen bond, they have a propensity to participate in disulfide bond. Which amino acid can participate in disulfide bond? Quick. Which amino acids participate in disulfide bond? Come on.
Sir, cysteine.
Cysteine, yes, cysteine. So you see, sometimes what happens, as you see this protein structure, sometimes the first amino acid, it actually goes and binds to the, if this is the ith amino acid, then you might see I2 I plus 3 or I2 I plus 4 hydrogen bonds. For example, see, this is the first amino acid and this is binding to the third amino acid. This is the first amino acid CO, this is the second amino acid CO, this is the third amino acid, and this is the fourth. So see, the first amino acid might be forming an hydrogen bond with the third amino acid, whereas the first amino acid might be also be forming a hydrogen bond with the fourth amino acid. And this I2 I plus 3 or I2 I plus 4 hydrogen bond actually brings this entire structure close together. It works like a spring and you get a alpha helix structure. It develops into an alpha helix structure. So any I2 I plus 3 or I plus 4 connection gives rise to this particular alpha helix structure. On the other hand, there might be alternative hydrogen bonds between two different chains. So this particular amino acid, rather than participating in an I2 I plus 3 bond like that, they participate in a hydrogen bond with the other amino acid in the other chain. And when that happens, they participate in a beta pleated sheet. They forms a beta pleated sheet. Okay, so in the protein structure, these are the beta pleated sheet. These long stretches of amino acids. See, these long stretches are the beta pleated sheet. Just let me hide. Just let me keep only one. Sorry. So see, this is the alpha helix structure. In a protein, when Y2 I plus 3 structuring occurs, this is the alpha helix pattern that you get. On the other hand, sometimes they also get associated with this particular form, that's I2 I plus 5 connections. Whenever you get I2 I plus 5 connections or I2 I plus 4 connections, that usually gives rise to this beta pleated sheets. Okay, you have this beta pleated sheets. And there are some amino acids that doesn't participate in any bond, and those are usually present in a loop-like formation. So see, these are the loops. This long range, these are the loops, which is not participating in any bond. These are the loops. Okay. And what happens after this particular bond happens, or you get these small motifs. These small motifs again binds with one another. They all starts interacting with one another, and you see this particular motif is folding with this particular motif, whereas this particular motif is folding onto this particular motif. And when several such folding occurs, you get to see a tertiary structure of a protein. You see this alpha helix binds to this alpha helix. This alpha helix again interacts with this beta sheet, and when this something occurs, you get a tertiary structure. And sometimes these tertiary structures are also stabilized by other ions. For example, in a heme group, you are going to find hemoglobin. You are going to find the heme group or the iron group, simply making sure that the bond is stable. In some proteins, that is done by the zinc ions. Okay, so like that everything occurs. But when several such tertiary structures interact with one another, when you have a particular protein, one tertiary structure interacting with the next one and the next one, then you get a quaternary structure like the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is an alpha 2 beta 2. That means two alpha molecules and two beta domains are actually interacting with one another to give this particular quaternary structure. So that is how the protein folds. Now, thing is that when we model the protein, how are we going to be sure that the protein modeling is correct or not? Because the modeling might be wrong, and nobody knows if the modeling is right or wrong, because there is no reference structure. Each protein has a unique structure. So how can you be sure that the protein that you have modeled is really correct structure or not? You can't be sure. Right? Yes, there are some ways to do it, but how to know it? I'm going to talk about it later. So see, first thing is that In this particular amino acid connections, generally you see that, so you get a peptide bond, right? In a particular amino acid, you have this peptide bond, that is the CONH bond. One peptide or one amino acid connects to the next amino acid, and this gives rise to a series of bonds. What kind of bonds? Whenever you have a C or the alpha, the carbon, the major carbon binding to the alpha carbon, that means this particular carbon, this is the alpha carbon, okay, the C alpha, the C alpha. When the C alpha binds to a carbon, this bond is known as C alpha bond is known as psi bond. The bond between C alpha is psi bond. The bond between N C alpha is the phi bond. Whereas the bond between N and C is the this bond. N and C is the omega bond. Okay, and this is the peptide bond, the CONH bond. See the CONH bond. The CONH bond is actually the omega bond, and that is actually really stable. It is not free to rotate. The backbone does not rotate, but the epsilon, this psi bond and phi bond can rotate a little bit. And theoretically, since this is a single bonded structure, they are allowed to have any angle starting from -180 to +180. They might have any angle. Now there is one scientist called G.N. Ramachandran. What he did, he actually calculated and he found out that yes, protein might have any angle, so it might be possible to have any angle. So he started analyzing the protein, but he found out that though theoretically phi and psi might have any angle possible, practically it is not seen. So when he plotted the phi and psi bond, he found out that they might have any bond, right? But they found out that every protein actually has a certain allowed region in which this phi psi angle values lie. And there's a whole bunch of black region, that is the disallowed region, where nothing is present, where actually no molecule or the peptide or normal protein can't have their phi psi angles. And he made some series of investigation and that revealed that if you have an alpha helix structure, if this is an alpha helix, and this alpha helix might be for any protein A, B, C, D, E, any protein, if it has an alpha helix domain, then the phi psi angle will, for the right-handed alpha helix, it will lie at this particular domain. They will lie at this junction, okay, only at this junction. Whereas for the left-handed alpha, it's going to lie at this particular region. 310 helix will lie at this region. The type 2 beta sheet, the parallel beta sheet, the polyploid helix, all they have a particular place where they are actually present. Whereas the loops might have any value, but that value might be within this particular red region. Whereas this black region is a totally disallowed region. Okay, so theoretically, though it is possible to have any angle, practically it is impossible to have any angle. It is actually impossible to have any angle. Only the predefined or allowed regions might have that particular angle. And when we model the protein, how can we be sure if that protein structure is correct or not? We might be sure that because when we model the protein, we will analyze the Ramachandran plot of that particular model protein. And after analyzing the Ramachandran plot of that particular protein, what will happen? We are going to see if any of the angle is lying in the disallowed region or not. And if they are lying on this disallowed region, we are going to know that that particular protein hasn't attained final folding. Because if a protein attains proper folding, not a single amino acid will be present in the disallowed region. But yes, there is some exception, and that the exception is actually glycine and proline. Since the proline doesn't have that kind of thing, it doesn't have that free amide group, okay, that is why it has some restriction in that particular folding, and that's why the glycine and proline might be present in the disallowed region, but not other amino acid. Only exceptions are glycine and proline. Okay, that might present in the disallowed region. Understand? Is this part clear?
Sir, proline have free amide, so there is no torsion angle for proline.
Yeah.
But glycine has amide. It can maybe freely rotate. That's
Yes,
why
glycine. The problem of glycine is since glycine doesn't have a R group, the glycine is highly flexible. Okay. Glycine doesn't have a R group, it only has a hydrogen, right? So it is highly flexible, and it is so flexible that it can attain any values. It is impossible to stabilize a glycine residue because it has nothing to get stable. It doesn't have an R group, right? And due to that particular thing,
Yes.
glycine might be present anywhere. It might attain any angles. Okay, but not the other group because they have a large thing attached to it. For example, suppose if you are walking by the road and you are carrying a heavy luggage in your hand, will it be possible for you to simply run around the road while traveling? It is impossible. And the normal amino acid, they have a heavy group called R group, and that's a huge group, and it is impossible for them to attain any kind of structures. But rather, a small child, if you're not holding his hand, what is going to happen? He or she, they're going to simply run around. They don't know what's happening. They have so much of energy, they're simply going to run around the road, and that's why you have to simply hold their hand, right? Because they are highly fluctuating. Same thing happens with the glycine also. Since they are small, they are highly fluctuating. Okay, so this is one thing that we're going to do. Not only this, along with it, there are few something analyzing thing which is going to analyze the entire structure of the protein. And how is it going to analyze it? That we're going to see later on when we finally model the protein. We want to take a look into that particular thing. Okay. Now the thing is that how a protein folds. The main thing is that while we discover and devise a particular modeling software, we first have to identify how a protein folds, right? How a protein is folding. And for that, Levi-Strauss was the first one who actually devised or identified how a protein actually folds. So he actually developed a thought experiment. Now, obviously, if you have, can anyone say, if I have 100 proteins, how many peptide bonds will I have? If I have 100 proteins, how many peptide bonds will I have?
Sir, 101. I'm not sure.
101. Not 101. See, because the last amino acid is not going to participate in a hydrogen bond. Sorry, it's not going to participate in
Yeah,
a
so
hydrogen bond.
90.
So 99. If I have 100 amino acid, there will be
Yeah,
99 99 what's called peptide bond. Okay. Now, since each of the peptide bonds, they are really different. Oh, sorry, each of the peptide bond carries a psi bond and a phi bond. So obviously, let's think that there are 101 amino acids. So we have 100 peptide bond. So obviously 100 peptide bond means 100 phi bond, 100 psi bond, right? So in total we have 200 phi and psi bond, right? Now theoretically it is possible for this 100 psi phi bond to attain any value from this particular stretch. Even if you start with this plus 62 plus 80, they might have any value. They might have 60.1, 60 point, and even if you let go the decimals, there are even at least 90 different ways in which they can actually attain a particular bond, right? Even if you let go the decimals, there are 90 different things that in which they can attain. But let's think that they can only assume 3 states. They can only assume 90 degree, 120 degree and 180 degree. Okay, only 3 states. And even if we consider 3 states, then how many conformations can they have? So it is going to be 3 to the power 200, because if they have 3 states and there are 200 phi psi bond, so number of conformations will be 3 to the power 200. And if you could simply solve this, you're going to see that particular value is actually 60 order magnitude longer than the age of the universe. But protein actually folds in millisecond to picosecond. It actually folds in milliseconds to nanoseconds. Okay, it doesn't take up that huge time to fold. So how does the protein fold so fast? How does the protein assume? Because how will the protein know which structure to assume? Because when we have the mRNA, and from the mRNA when the protein is getting translated, we are only seeing one amino acid binding to the next. There is no memory and anything. So how will a protein know how to fold? There is no one helping the protein to fold. There is no one helping the protein to fold, right? So how will that particular protein know? This is one of the paradox. Okay, so people have tried to identify and understand how the protein folds, and that's why Levinthal actually, to answer this Levinthal's paradox, a folding funnel has been established. And what does the folding funnel tell you? The folding funnel actually tells you that this particular thing called, when you have a fold, if you have this funnel, when a protein is at the top of the funnel, it is highly energetic structure. It is full of energy. There is full of energy in that particular protein, and that is why the protein is in an unfolded state. Now, can anyone say why, if a protein has huge energy, it is going to have an unfolded state? Very easy answer. Why, if a protein has huge amount of energy, why will it have an unfolded state? Are you all connected?
Sir,
Yes, sir.
Okay.
sir, don't know this.
Very easy. Because what? Because the unfolding is going to happen. Why? Because see, when you have a lot of energy, then there won't be any bond to a particular protein. Because if there is lot of energy, it will break up the bond, right? For example, suppose you are making some tea. Okay, you are making some tea or you are boiling water. If you are taking the water in a particular pan and if you are not heating it, will the water boil or will the water tumble? It won't tumble. But
No.
while you are applying heat, while you have switched on the stove, or if you are using electric heater, if you are switching on that particular switch, what's going to happen? It's going to get a lot of heat, and you get to see that the water is tumbling. The water molecule starts to stumble, and you get to see that the water starts boiling. And sometimes, if it's a milk, it's going to come out of that can. If you don't switch off that thing, it's going to come out of that can. And we in Bengali we say that दूध उतले उठेছে, right? So it's going to simply come out of the pan and fall out because there is huge amount of heat. And that is why even if a particular protein has huge amount of heat, what will happen? It is simply going to break up the bond. All the bonds are going to break up, and that is why the protein will be present in a particular unfolded conditions. Clear? Now, as the protein starts to come down to this particular funnel, so it's in a complete unfolded state, and usually that happens whenever the protein starts getting translated. It has an unfolded condition. Now slowly as the protein starts to move down the funnel, what happens? The protein starts to lose the energy. It starts to lose the energy, and ultimately as it reaches the ground state, it is known as global minima. And at the global minima, the protein has least amount of energy. It has least amount of energy, and the least amount of energy gives rise to proper folded structure. At that particular junction, the folding protein is folded in a correct manner. All the protein is folded in a particular correct manner. It's not going to change its structure in a global minima. Okay. And as it soon comes down to this particular thing, what happens? So how does a protein fold it? So as soon as the protein starts falling from this particular funnel, the first thing it does is it starts to bury all the non-polar amino acid. There are a number of polar amino acid and non-polar amino acid, right? And obviously the polar amino acids are there, which is going to interact with water, while the non-polar is not going to interact with water. But do you know that sometimes what happens? In our body is made up of 70% water, right? So be it cytosol, be it blood, be it anything, nucleoplasm, anything, it is full of water. It is a water condition. It's full of water. So obviously, if you have non-polar amino acid at the topology or the surface, the protein structure is going to be unstable. The protein is not going to be a stable one. So that is why, and since they are hydrophobic moiety, hydrophobic amino acid, the first job is to bring down and push all the hydrophobic amino acid into it's going to bury it inside. So it is kept away from water, whereas the rest of the polar amino acids are kept at the surface. So that is the first effect, the hydrophobic effect that actually kicks in. And slowly as it happens, so now the non-polar molecules are buried inside, so you have a structure. Now that structure is further stabilized by van der Waals interaction, electrostatic interaction, Coulombic interaction, Lennard-Jones potential. All this interaction kicks in, and along with it you get to see the disulfide bonds, the hydrogen bonds that starts to stabilize the protein structure so that it is not going to break up. And as the energy comes down, the protein attains a properly folded structure. Same like us. In the morning we have a lot of energy. We are simply, after getting up, yes, you feel a lethargic, but after we take a bath and we are fresh, we simply go out. We try to fight, and we have a multiple conformations. It's not that whenever in the morning when we get out of that particular office, we go to the college and all. It's not like that. It's reaching the college, I'm like, I'm feeling so tired. It happens some days, but not every day. And after that, what happens? As the day progresses, you start to lose energy, and obviously at evening what happens, you are again full of energy. You are going out with your friend, you are partying, you are dancing and everything, and after that, as the night kicks in, slowly you feel that yes, I don't have that energy, any energy left in my body, and slowly you assume a particular state. Okay, it happens that, and after that slowly what happens, you attain a particular conformation, and while we sleep we don't move a lot. We have a proper structure because we are at an energetically lowest form, and that is what happens when a protein reaches this bottom. But recently people found out that that is not the way how the protein actually folds, and they found out that it's not a smooth journey. It is like moving up and down a hill. So it's not that when the protein is coming down this funnel, it is moving slowly, it's simply coming down. No, that doesn't happen. It's like a trekking part. Suppose if I want to do a trekking and want to get up on a particular mountain or go to Mount Everest, what happens? I have to climb up several hills. I have to climb down several hills. Now after slowly climbing up and down, I slowly reach the top. It's not like that if you want to go to Mount Everest, you are only climbing up. No, it doesn't happen like that. It's not like that you are only climbing up. You have to climb up some hill. You have to go down. Again you have to climb up a hill, and slowly you reach the mountain at the top of the planet, right? Okay. So what is this hills? So later people found out that yes, the first thing that what people does or the protein does is obviously it binds it, the hydrophobic effect kicks in, and it tries to bury all the hydrophobic molecules inside. But that's not correct, and when the protein is falling down the line, as it reaches the local minima, now this is a local minima. Now currently this is actually the global maxima. The top of the funnel is the global maxima, and bottom of the funnel is global minima. But it's small. When the protein is coming down and coming at the base of a hill, it is the local minima. When the protein folds and reaches a local minima, it actually pushes away all the hydrophobic group into it buries inside. But soon, whatever protein structure you find, you are going to find out that it's not that always the non-polar amino acids are buried inside. There are some non-polar molecules that are present at the topology, and they are essential for the protein function. Okay, so now what happens? Now since the protein has already made a move, now it have to break up the structure. So it again starts to climb up a hill. That is, it starts to gain the energy, and that energy breaks up that particular protein structure, and slowly some of the non-polar molecules that are intended to be present outside or to be at the surface of topology, that are actually brought outside. And when the protein gains energy, the bond again starts to break, and the protein, and as it attains and reaches the local maxima, the protein attains a particular structure. Now after that, it again starts slowly come down again, and again the protein starts to forming those bonds and all, and after slowly it reaches another local minima, and this thing goes on and on until the protein attains a particular proper structure, proper folding, and ultimately it reaches the global minima. Understand? So this is how the protein actually folds, correct? Okay, so we have to mimic this whole thing. So to make or predict the structure, so why are you learning it? Because we have to mimic this whole thing, because if you don't know how the protein folds, how can I use or develop a software that can mimic protein folding, or that will allow protein folding, correct? So this is very important. Now when a protein, so first thing is that, so this is how the protein actually folds. Okay, so now our job is actually to find out the protein which needs to be folded. But for that, before that, we have to learn about a particular database. And why the database? Because the database are there that actually helps us in this proper protein folding or the structural bioinformatics part, or to know about the particular protein. Because the first thing that we need about a protein is the sequence of the protein, right? To make or predict a structure, we need the sequence of the protein. But how will I know the sequence of the protein? Who is going to give me the sequence of the protein? There are certain databases that actually caters to this need. They actually have all the informations that are actually there that are required to know about a particular protein. Now you can use that for any kind of research. You can use it for your own thesis writing. You can use it for protein structure preparation. You can use it for any kind of research or any kind of thing. You actually have to, you can do that. And for that, we have to learn about that particular one of that particular database. Okay. So one of the database that actually caters to this need is actually the UniProt database. Just click on this particular link, and as you click on this link, this particular structure is going to open up, this particular panel. So this is one of the database. It's a protein database. Now what's a protein database? Now there are each day a lot of people are actually working with this particular protein. They are all working with this particular protein, and what happens as they work with this particular protein, we obviously come down and we know that they're coming out with new informations, and obviously this information has to be stored in a particular site, because if these informations are not stored, they are going to get lost. And how you are going to know what to do? Because for example, suppose right now today you are working with a particular protein, okay, and suppose you want to work and see the effect of that particular protein in a particular disease. Now before you, a lot of people have already worked with this particular proteins, right? So all the information are stored there, because if you don't know those information, you have to start with the beginning. You have to start at the beginning. So if a particular person is working about a particular protein at USA, and if you don't know anything, nobody can move anywhere. Nobody can update their information. They have to update their information, and this is the site where every information on a particular protein is stored. So currently you see there are different fractions. There is a UniRef. The UniRef is actually the sequence database where all the sequences are kept. Then you have the UniPark and the proteome. Now this proteome database is actually the set of all the proteins of a particular molecule. Now for this you have there's a proteome of Drosophila, there's a proteome of human, there's a proteome of bacteria, because not always every person is not working with human. They're all, some is working with Drosophila, some is working with bacteria, because some proteins are really common. They are present in both Drosophila, human, bacteria. So and those systems actually allow you to have a very proper function, because if I can mutate a protein, I want to clone a protein, I can't use a human. I can't use a human subject. That's against ethics. So I have to set up some other organism in which I can work. So that's how these are the basic things. Okay. So now this search word actually allows you to search for a particular protein. For example, suppose I want to know about this particular VEGF protein. So what to do? So simply in this particular, just write the name of the protein that you want. Suppose I want to know about VEGF protein. Okay. This is another protein that I want to know about. So okay. Now as you write down the name of that protein, it's going to show you that particular protein of all the species. So first we have the VEGF that belongs to human. So this is the protein name, the gene name, and the organism with which it belongs to. The second one is the VEGF of mouse. See, mouse. Next is the VEGF of the Canis lupus. That is the dog. Next you have the VEGF of Danario regio. This is zebrafish. Okay. Give me a minute. Okay. Now see, suppose we want to know about the VEGF of human. So what to do? Simply click on this particular entry. See this entry. Click on this particular entry. Now you might click on to that particular protein of whoever I want, but we have to talk about the human. Okay. So first you have this VEGF. Now is going to give you the name of the gene, the organism with which it belongs to, and the status. The status is review. That means a lot of people have worked with this particular thing. And there's a score. The annotation score is 5-star. That means people have evidenced about this particular protein at experimental level, at protein level. They have worked with this particular protein, developed antibody, and they found this protein to be work with the human cell. Okay. And since a lot of people have worked with this particular thing, it's a 5-star. Okay. So next, the function. So if you read, it's going to give you the basic function of this particular molecule. So see, this is a growth factor that is active in angiogenesis, vasculogenesis, and endothelial cell growth. But before I go in any further, I'm going to say you the role of this particular protein. Now, as I've told you, this particular protein is associated with angiogenesis. And what happens in angiogenesis is the formation of new blood vessels, right? That means whether you get a cut, suppose each day some cells die. At our body, there are some cells that die, and each day we get new cells. So the blood vessels are also cells, they also die. So when those blood vessels die, you require new blood vessels at their location. Or sometimes suppose you got a cut at your hand, or you sometimes fall and you get a cut at your leg or somewhere. Now slowly as you get a cut, that means those cells in that particular area, they are dead, right? So after a few days, new cells starts to grow, and now those new cell or each cell, why do they need the blood vessel? Because the blood vessel is the only thing that can supply the nutrition to the cells. We are eating a lot of things. We are eating pizza, we are eating chicken, we are eating a lot of things. But how is that nutrition coming to you? At the end of the day, the nutrition is actually, it gets digested, it gets absorbed through the blood, and through the blood it is actually supplied to all of the cells. And the cells, they take those basic amino acid and all, and actually they process it. They take the glucose, they process it to produce the ATPs. Okay, and this is done by this particular is going to sorry, what I was talking about. Okay, so yes, is that they are actually now what happens if you start to eat a lot of things? You are going to get fat like me. So right now, currently what happens, everyone is at their home, they're all eating up, and obviously we're going to get fat. But yes, trust me, in this particular lockdown I have lost a lot of weight. I actually exercised a lot, okay, and I have lost a lot of it. But yes, if you eat like me, you are going to get fat. And the same thing happens with the cell also. If the cell gets a lot of nutrition, if there are a lot of nutrition flowing to the cell is also going to fat, right? And what happens when the cells get fat? We call them tumors. So if there are several, if you have higher VEGF, that means it is going to produce higher number of blood vessels at a particular location, and cells at those locations, they are going to get higher number of nutrition, and slowly what will happen? Those cells are going to get fat and you are going to get tumors. Okay, that's how the VEGF actually promotes cancer. Okay, but so there's one way of treating cancer is to give the anti-VEGF drug. So the anti-VEGF drug goes and destroys the VEGF protein. And as the VEGF protein gets destroyed, what happens? The blood vessel formation stops. And as the blood vessel formation stops, it's simply like those cells are going into a diet mode. And what happens when we go to a diet mode? We get thin, and that's to happens, the protein starts losing their weight, and slowly the tumor shrinks and the cancer is gone. Okay, so but not every cancer is associated with VEGF. There are sometimes, as I've told you, there are multiple proteins that are associated with it. But one of the way to treat cancer is the anti-VEGF drug. So that is the general function of the protein. Okay, but there are also, since it's a growth factor, it also controls several different things. Okay, it inhibits apoptosis, it also promotes the cellular growth, proliferation, all of these things. Okay, so next we get to see the gene ontology term, the molecular function of the particular protein. So these are the molecular function of the particular protein, the chemoattractant activity, cytokine activity, all these things. Next you have the biological process. Now can anyone say the difference between molecular function and the biological process? What is the difference between molecular function and biological process? Now see the molecular function. Molecular function means what? Molecular function means the function of that particular molecule, what it is doing. For example, it is binding to the growth factor receptor. Okay, so receptor ligand activity, it is binding to a particular receptor. It has cytokine activity. But how it is impacting the total biological process. For example, in your school, as I've told you, you have some headmaster who is actually taking part of the every nitty-gritty details. You have a peon whose job is to simply ring the bell. Okay, so what is the molecular function of peon? The molecular function of peon is to ring the bell. But what is the biological process, or the process he is affecting? He is affecting or is helping into running the school. So that is the process he is involved in. Similarly, it can bind to growth factor, but how is it, what it is it doing by binding to it? It helps in angiogenesis, it helps in artery morphogenesis, it helps in cell maturation, and these are the source of this thing. It's not like that everything is updated simply by the word. Since I am telling it, update it. No, you have to provide the source, and these are the source. For example, see, if you click on this particular thing, it's going to give you the papers or the research article where the people have actually worked and they have shown this particular biological effect to be affected by VEGF. Okay, and all these are attracted by a source. So if you simply click on this particular thing, so suppose I'm clicking here, have this particular thing, and then simply click on this PubMed, and the PubMed you can go and read about this particular paper, or you can simply select this entire structure, or it's better to click on this PubMed. So see, this particular paper I've opened up. So this is the particular paper. So you can read this paper using this full text link. You can read the paper and you're going to know how it is affecting this whole thing, or if you want to know in detail. Okay, what was I? Yes. So coming down, so see, this is how many different functions it actually, biological process it affects. See, now sometimes there are duplicating events there, but don't worry. But still, the VEGF is a very important function. Okay. The next section is the name and taxonomy. That means what's the taxonomic lineage of this particular molecule. This molecule actually starts with the eukaryota, metazoa, chordata, and ultimately it actually is present in Homo sapiens. Okay, so this is a taxonomic lineage. It's actually present in VEGF, also alternative name, all this kind of thing. Next, you get to see the subcellular localization. That is where this particular protein is present. Some proteins are present in cytosol, some in nucleus, some in mitochondria. But this particular protein is a secreted protein. Obviously, because this is a growth factor, it has to be secreted, right? And for this, you have 3 publications that caters to this particular need. Yes, it's a secreted protein. That's why you see that outside of the protein is actually made in a pink or a cream color, right? So this is to say that this particular protein is not present in cell. This is expressed outside, secreted protein. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Suppose I have given you 2 proteins, and I've given you the protein sequence as well. How can you say which protein is a secreted protein and which is a intracellular protein? How can you say? If I simply give you 2 proteins and say, kindly tell me which protein is the intracellular protein and which is the secreted protein, how will you say? Or how will you determine?
Sir, by sequencing the protein.
By sequencing the protein, what information will you get? You are going to get the protein sequence.
Nucleotide.
No, by sequencing the protein, you are going to get the protein sequence, the amino acid, right? But from
Yes,
amino acid, how will you conclude that this protein is secreted outside and this protein is present inside the cell?
Sir, by searching it on the database.
That's a very easy thing to do, but not that. Suppose that's a very novel protein. You are the first one to identify or discover that protein. Now, obviously, that protein is not going to be present in database because it is you who will update that particular protein in the database, right? So now, how are you going to deduce it?
So, if the protein is intracellular, then it may bind. It may be DNA binding protein, or it is extracellularly secreted.
Not all intracellular proteins are DNA binding, because to bind to DNA, you have to be inside the nucleus. Okay. Now, not all proteins are DNA binding proteins. Some of the proteins are DNA binding proteins. Some of the proteins are not DNA binding proteins.
Yeah. Sorry, sir. No.
No, don't worry. No need to be sorry. Come on. I like that you are giving answer. It might be wrong, so don't worry about it. I'm not here to give you marks. We are here to learn, right? So see, the thing is that in any kind of protein, if it is a secreted protein, they have a short signal peptide that is attached at their N terminus, the signal peptide. Can you say where the protein is translated? Where the protein is translated? At the endoplasmic reticulum, right? So after the protein is translated at endoplasmic reticulum, it is actually sent out to various other parts of the cell. And who does this protein sorting? Who helps in protein sorting?
Sir,
Yes. Golgi
Golgi
bodies.
apparatus.
Absolutely right. Golgi bodies. They help in protein sorting. And specifically, which proteins help in protein sorting? Which proteins help in protein sorting? COP1 and COP2, right? Come on, these are very basic things. Okay, so now see.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Whenever there are some proteins which needs to be secreted outside, they have a short signal peptide that is attached to their N-terminal region. And by identifying that or seeing that signal peptide, that particular protein is actually pushed outside. So the Golgi apparatus sees that yes, this have a signal peptide. Simply send it to that particular, send it to the cell membrane. So then they are going to send it to the cell membrane. And at the cell membrane, there is another protein who is going to identify and see that yes, do you have signal peptide? It's going to see yes, I have signal peptide. They're going to take that signal and then cleave off that signal peptide. They're going to cleave off the signal peptide and going to push the cell outside the cell. They push the protein outside the cell. Simply like you have a ticket. Suppose you have brought a ticket. You are going to see a movie. So what happens at the door? They tear apart the ticket, right? Same thing happens. You have a signal peptide. They simply cleave the signal peptide before releasing it, right? And by seeing that particular ticket, you can gain entry into that particular thing. That happens in the cell as well. And for the cell which are the proteins which do not require to be secreted outside, they don't have that signal peptide. Okay. So simply by seeing the signal peptide, you get to know that yes, if that particular protein, now every secreted protein, all the proteins in all over globe, every secreted protein, they have a what is that? Signal peptide at this front. Okay. Now the next section is the pathology and biotech. That means how much or by what thing, how is this particular protein developed or involved in disease. So you simply read this particular thing and you will know about how this protein is involved in this particular disease. Okay. And apart from it, you also get to see the various organism-specific database and all. I'm not going to talk about this right now. Okay. So next is the most important thing, that is the post-translational modifications. That means how is that particular protein processed. Now see, the first feature is the signal peptide. And what is that? That is molecule processing. Signal peptide, position 1 to 26. It is actually cleaved off. So you get to see the only processing or only kind of amine molecule processing that occurs is that the signal peptide is actually cleaved off. Okay, and the rest of the part that is starts from 27 to 232, that is the main VEGF-A protein. Okay, main VEGF-A protein. Now, apart from it, are there any other modifications in amino acid? Yes, there are. What is? You have disulfide bond between 52nd and 94th cysteine. Whereas the 77th cysteine, it participates in interchain disulfide bond. That means it participates in VEGF binding of with the outside chain. Now see, this is a VEGF protein. This is a 54 to 52nd to 94. Let's see, 52nd. Do we have 52nd cysteine here? Now the sequence might be a little different because yes, this is this is a vascular permeability factor. This is not a VEGF protein. Okay, sorry, that's why the sequence is not similar. Okay, this is not the protein. Okay, but yes, the 52nd and 94th amino acid, they are actually in a disulfide bond, whereas the 83rd and 128, they also forms a disulfide bond interaction with one another, but for that particular protein. And then there are several other proteins which have some other modifications as well. So I have opened another protein, the nucleolin protein. Okay, now see, this particular protein is actually present inside the cell. It binds to DNA. So you see, it is present in cytoplasm as well, and also present inside the nucleolus. So you have to find the cytoplasm as well as in nucleolus because it binds to the DNA. It acts as a transcription factor. So you see, it is localized inside. Okay. Now apart from it, now you see this post-translational modification. What kind of processing here occurs? See, since this is an intracellular protein, it doesn't have a signal peptide. Rather, it have an initiator methionine which is actually removed. And you know that every protein undergoes this methionine removal, right? Is it correct? Every protein undergoes methionine removal. Yes, it goes. And next you see the amino acid modification. Now see how it is modified. The 9th amino acid, that lysine residue, is actually acetylated, whereas the 15th lysine is also acetylated. The 28th serine is also phosphorylated. You get to see the all this now this threonine, the 69th threonine, it gets phosphorylated. So like that you get to see all the modifications. And why is this important? Why is this important? Because sometimes these modifications are associated with the activity of a particular protein. So if a particular phosphorylation might lead to binding of that protein with DNA, another phosphorylation breaks off that binding of that protein with DNA, so that is not going to bind to that particular DNA. Another phosphorylation or acetylation might lead to the degradation of that particular protein. So all of this, they have a important, these modifications are not random, they all have some unique function associated with this particular modification, and your body actually becomes ill whenever some of these particular modifications suffer. So if a particular lysine is not acetylated, you might feel that particular protein is not getting activated. So what happens? You get a cancer patient, you simply isolate. I'm only talking about cancer, but it doesn't mean that the protein modification only associated with cancer. No, it's not that. Number of all of the diseases happen due to this particular thing. I'm only giving you an example. So you got a cancer patient, you took out that particular proteome, you find out that yes, this particular, now generally we know what kind of cancer is associated with what kind of protein. For example, anyone with if someone has breast cancer, now breast cancer is usually associated with the overexpression of c-MYC protein and VEGF protein. So obviously when a particular person comes with a breast cancer, we're going to identify and see if that particular VEGF or c-MYC is undergoing any mutation or not. And I see that yes, that particular VEGF or protein or that particular c-MYC protein is getting mutated. How mutation? What kind of mutation? You might see that either there is no post-processor modification is happening, or you might see a particular amino acid got mutated. But to know about that amino acid, you have to know the sequence. Currently, we don't know the sequence yet, right? But this amino acid modifications will help you to learn and know about how the protein structure is changing, how it is getting affected and all. Okay. So after that happens, next this particular thing is going to be very important, and next you get to see the interaction thing. Now what is interaction? Now as I have told you that each protein, to show its function, has to interact with the other protein. They have to interact with other protein. They have to interact with the other protein, right? And as you know, so which other protein are they interacting to? So that is the thing that this particular thing is going to show you. For example, if you simply say that this nucleolin is interacting with the AICDA, it is interacting with the APTX, it's interacting with CIQBP. So these are all the different protein with which this particular protein interacts and gives you a particular function. Now, in any kind of disease, you might feel or you might see that yes, this particular protein is not connecting or not interacting with this particular protein. So when this particular protein interaction is hampered, the normal cell signaling pathway of that particular protein is hampered. Okay, so that is why this whole protein content is, you can see, you might see that how they're actually interacting to it, how they are actually find or binding to it and all, and you can also change to it. Obviously, how can you change it? See, under this binary section, for example, suppose
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
just a minute. Okay. Now you see what happens. Suppose you have this particular disease. Now you might select a particular disease. For example, suppose I will select glaucoma. Now in this particular case of glaucoma, you are going to see that the nucleolin is interacting with this COIA1 human. And what about the esophageal cancer? In case of esophagus cancer, you see that this particular protein is interacting to P53, 1433Z, ARRB1 human. So if you see that yes, in some cancer or this in esophageal cancer, this particular interaction is not happening, you know that there is some disturbances that are associated with this particular interaction. That might be due to a mutation, that might be due to a presence of an inhibitor, that might be, now that is the job, that why this interaction is not happening. Okay, and you have to develop a drug against it so that this kind of interaction happens. Okay, so that's the way to prevent this particular cancer and all. Okay, so these are sorry, so these are the things that actually happens, and these are the things that we can actually look into. Now further, if you come down, you have to get the structure of the particular protein. Now this is the structure of the particular protein. Okay, now see, this is the structure of the particular protein. Now this is not the entire structure, a small domain. Okay, and how this structure is solved? See, this structure is solved by the NMR method, and this is the nucleus long protein, and this is from only 564 to 652 domain. Okay, only this is the domain of this particular protein, not the entire structure. And whereas this particular entry, I am selecting second entry, this is also solved by NMR structure, and this domain is from 478 to 565. So this is how the protein actually looks like. So I am not only getting that particular thing, but I am also getting about to know about this particular interaction. And now if you simply select a particular residue, suppose this, if you highlight here, see at the bottom of the screen here, you get to see the amino acid that is, suppose active lysine, and if you click it, you're going to see the bonds that are associated with that particular residue. You get to see all the bonds. Now see, this is actually participating in a hydrogen bond. So what residues are participating in hydrogen bond? This is one of the residues. This is arginine 76. This is participating in hydrogen bond with the isoleucine 83. Okay, so this kind of bond, this is how you can get to know the protein structure. But there is another structure database that we will talk later. Okay, and the structure base is a different thing, we will talk later, don't worry. This is not a structure database. This is a database that is associated with this, only the protein structure. We will talk about it later. So slowly again, if you
So what is domain?
what is, where is
Domain.
domain? Means a particular small segment of a particular protein. So if it's a 100 amino acid long protein, amino acid 1 to 10 is a small domain, 20 to 30 might be another domain. You might have a functional domain. Now the functional domain is now the whole total protein is not the functionally active, right? A small part of the protein is functionally active. So that is a functional domain, and that might comprise of 10 amino acid or 5 amino acid or 6 amino acid. So that's the small part or small domain. You might have a allostatic domain, you might have a activation domain, the particular domain at which the protein gets modified, okay, to make it active. Okay. So now again, if you come down, now see, we have to know the protein structure. So this is a family of protein. We are not interested about the family of protein. So afterward, if you simply come down, you are going to get to see the, so this is the structure we have already discussed. Next, you get to see the sequence of the protein. So this is the sequence of the protein, and this is what we require for protein structure isolation or elucidation. So what? So this is the single amino acid structure, and this is the amino acid number. The 10th is the, this is the 10th amino acid. The 20 denotes that this is the 20th amino acid. This denotes the 30th amino acid. Okay. But this is the isoform of VGF206. Now, as I have told you, and as you have someone, I think Shweta was it, who mentioned it, that there are alternative splicing that occurs, and alternative splicing leads to various different isoform of a particular protein, right? Various isoform of a particular protein. So this is one of the isoform. Then you have the next isoform, the VGF189. So how is this isoform different to that? See, the region 166 to 182 is missing. That means 160, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this region 166 to 182, this particular domain is actually missing in this VGF189. Whereas in 183, 160 to 180 missing. That means this particular domain is missing. Whereas in this particular isoform 165, the 141th lysine is mutated to asparagine, and this domain is missing. This is the 141th lysine. So this is actually mutated to asparagine. Okay. Now you might see, suppose in case of, let's see about nucleolin. Suppose, let's go back here. So see, the 9th lysine is getting acetylated. Do you have acid lysine at 9th position? See, we have lysine at 9th position, and this particular lysine gets acetylated. So that is how you can get to see this information and cross check it, and you can obviously find out if this particular proteins are actually working okay or not. And how are all the, now see, if you see all the different isoform have different structure, different sequence. Now if you are keen on working with this VGF 148 isoform, then you have to make sure that you have this particular structure with this modifications. Okay, lysine, this 215th alanine is mutated to methionine, and these regions are missing. So like that you get to find these sequences. And the important thing is that this is actually the 1-letter amino acid code residue, but sometimes we are going to require the FASTA format of a particular molecule. What is FASTA format now? FASTA format is just a different format for representing the protein sequence. The FASTA format, how it looks like and how we're going to get it. See, just beside this particular thing you have the word called FASTA. So simply click on this FASTA and you get to see the FASTA format. This is the FASTA format. Now how is the FASTA format different? The FASTA format starts with a greater than sign. It starts with a greater than sign, and then on that same line you're going to write the name of the protein. You might or you might not write anything. You might keep it blank. But the main important thing is that after the greater than sign, you're going to start the 1-letter code from the next line, not from the immediate line. You're going to start the amino acid sequence in 1-letter code from the next line, and after the this greater than sign you're going to write the name of the protein. You can write the name of the protein, your name. You might write anything. You might write arbitrarily anything, and that is the thing that's going to identify the protein. It's like, sir, naming the protein just for your own sake. Okay, so if you upload this FASTA format to any protein server or modeling server, it's going to show you how the structure is happening, or how the particular model or the structure is going to find the structure and all. Okay, and again you get to, and simply how to save this, simply use this, copy this and paste it anywhere. So we are going to get the FASTA format. So this is how we are going to retrieve the sequence of a particular protein. While we model, we have to have the sequence of a particular protein, and this is how we this is how we retrieve the sequence. Okay, and apart from it, if you go down, there is nothing much more, anything. You have the similar protein name and the cross references. These cross references are not required because there are multiple databases and all the databases are connected to one another. But for protein, UniProt is the best database. Okay, there is also other database like RCSB PDB database. We will talk about RCSB PDB the next day. Okay, and apart from it, we have the NCBI. Now all of them are cross-linked with one another, and you see currently all of them are going to give you the same answer, but this particular UniProt only talks about protein. It doesn't give you any information about the mRNA or the gene sequence, nothing like that, only the protein sequences and all. Okay, so this is the utility of this particular protein. And the main thing is that, so currently I'm going to show you how to analyze the basic structure of this particular molecule. Okay, not homology, I'm not going to go on homology. So now suppose you have this particular protein. Now you want to know the secondary structure of a particular protein. Now just to get the glimpse or understand how that particular protein is going to look like. So how to do it? So there's one different factor or sector for that particular thing, and that is the Chow and Fastman domain. Okay. So this is one of the servers that can actually help you to predict the protein structure. Okay, so how is it going to help me predict the protein structure? So see, what it's going to do is you have to upload the protein sequence. See, enter the protein sequence in FASTA format. So you have to upload the protein sequence in FASTA format here. So sorry, not this. So you have to copy this FASTA format here and upload the protein structure, and simply click on predict, and that's all. Now it's going to predict the entire secondary structure of your particular protein. Remember, this server is not going to give you the 3D model of a protein. Okay, but it's going to predict the secondary structure. How it's going to see? So first you're going to show the entire protein sequence that you have uploaded, and then show the total entire length of the protein. For example, the basic structure. This red represents the helix, whereas the green represents the beta sheet structure. The blue represents the turns, whereas the yellow represents the random coils that are present in a protein. So this is so what are turns? this small section that actually joins two segment, this is a turn. Okay, this is a turn. The small segment is a turn. This small segment is a turn, whereas this entire large region is a loop, or this is a coil. Okay, this is the coil, whereas this small segment that joins two secondary structure together, this is known as a coil or a turn. Okay, so these turns are represented as blue, whereas the coils are represented as this yellow lines. Okay, so next you're going to get the entire prediction. So this is the amino acid. So first it's going to predict the helix nature. So according to helix nature, it predicts that yes, this entire stretch is the alpha helix domain. So this entire stretch is alpha helix forming domain. Okay, this entire stretch is the alpha helix forming domain. But when it predicts the beta sheet structure, it also says that though this domain has a tendency to fold into alpha helix, it also has the tendency, this particular domain, this domain also has the tendency to fold in alpha helix as well as in a beta sheet structure. This particular domain also has the tendency to fold into alpha helix as well as beta sheet. Okay, but this particular domain, see, the server is sure enough that this particular domain doesn't have the tendency to fold into beta sheet. So that is why finally it has given that particular domain a helix nature, whereas this particular domain, the server has denoted that though they have a propensity to form alpha helix and beta sheet same, but the propensity to form beta sheet is much more. So generally it has given this particular domain a beta sheet structure, whereas this domain has the alpha helix nature. So like that, it has actually associated, it gives entire structure or isolates and gives you the entire structure of this total protein. You might see the total residue also. See, so what's the number of residue in helix? There are 146 residues in the alpha helix formation. There is 130 residues that are participating in beta sheet formation, and there are 25 molecules or residues that are participating in turns, and this is in respect to the percentage. Okay, 62.8 helix. E actually stands for beta sheet. Okay, always remember, in case of proteomics or protein bioinformatics, the E stands for the beta sheet structure. Okay, always it is, in every case scenario it is. So if you want to know about a particular structure of protein rather than modeling a protein, suppose you are not a structural biologist, so you are not interested about the particular total protein structure, you only want to know about the basic protein. Okay, now in this particular case, you are going to give this particular domain you are going to identify using this CFFS, the Chou-Fasman domain, and going to give you this particular structure. So how it is going to look like, or what's the secondary structure of this entire domain, like that. Okay, any question now?
No, sir.
Okay, fine. So we're actually stopping here today, and in the next class we're going to discuss about this 3D structure modeling. We're going to identify and see how we can model a protein. This is the secondary structure we got, the 2D level, but at 3D level we have to identify the structure. Okay, and for that always please download and install that PyMol software in your computer. Okay, and I have shown you how to download it and keep it installed in your computer because we will require that particular structure. Understand? And the next thing is that keep okay, no, that's not required. Okay, so that will only do. So we have the next class in next week in Saturday, right? So
Yes, sir. Next class will be on 24.
yes, so we'll meet up then and we'll discuss the rest of the issue. So anyone has any question regarding the thing that I have taught till today?
No, sir.
Okay, fantastic. So we will meet again next day. Yeah, yes, yes, Pushpa.
So Chou and Fasman is a
Yes, Chou and Fasman.
database or
No, it's not a database. Chou and Fasman data. UniProt is a database where the data are stored, whereas the Chou and Fasman is a server that actually helps you to predict the secondary structure of a particular protein. Okay, suppose today you have identified a novel protein whose nothing is known about that particular protein. Okay, or the structure of that particular protein is not solved. There are many proteins whose structure is not solved. For example, if you take about the nucleolin protein, so see, the nucleolin protein is actually 710 amino acid long, but if you see the structure, only certain domains of a particular protein structure is solved. 300 to 466, 478 to 566. Not the entire structure is never solved. No one has been able to solve the entire structure. So if you want to know about the importance of this particular front portion, suppose you want to know how this particular portion looks like till 200. So there is no structure that gives you information about that first 200 amino acid, right? So you can upload that particular thing in the secondary server, this Chow and Fastman server, to get idea about that secondary structure nature. You might also input any novel protein. Suppose you came across a particular protein and you want to solve the structure of that particular protein. It's a novel protein. So you have to upload that structure there and get the idea from here. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Okay. So good night then. We'll see again the next week. And we'll start from where we left off. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay, sir.
Sure. Thank you. Bye. I think you are able to understand everything that I've taught you.